Blog Talk Radio.
Well, it's Thursday, February 24th, 2011. I'm your host, Poke Runyon, and tonight we're having a discussion on one of the most influential modern occult classics, the mysterious, mystical Kybalion, by the equally mysterious and mystical Three Initiates. Now, this little blue book has been treasured by students of the Western Mysteries since its first publication way back in 1908. I have 1912, but apparently it's 1908 was the first one. Our very special guest tonight will be Reverend Paul Clark, who is the steward, the Fraternity of Hidden Light. He portrayed the Master Jesus in Beyond Lemuria. And he's perhaps the best qualified scholar teacher to explain who the original authors were, and where their philosophy came from, and why the book is still very important and meaningful. And I will try to explain, Paul and I both will try to explain, the connections to actual Greek and Greco-Egyptian Hermetic philosophy that underlies this modern classic. Now, this is going to be an enlightening hour, unveiling the secrets of an obscure and mysterious work. And as I said, tune in and get inspired and demystified. Now, almost everyone who investigates, especially in studies, the Western esoteric tradition, has at one time or another come across the Kybalion, and quite frankly, most of us have read it. Many of us have read it several times. It's a very, very nice little blue book published by the Yogi Publication Society, and that, of course, was it still is a publication house that was owned by its principal writer in the early days, William Walter Atkinson. And William Walter Atkinson was quite an adept, and he wrote many books on yoga and different schools of yoga under the name Lemuria, who Paul tells me that was the name of his yoga master, but he used that name as a pseudonym for these 14 different books on yoga, all of which were very good. Now, the Kybalion purports to be Hermetic philosophy, and it is Hermetic philosophy, but it's Hermetic philosophy seen through a modern filter. That in no way invalidates it. It's a great book, and in fact, one of the things that we're going to try to do tonight is we're going to try to rehabilitate the Kybalion for modern intellectual readers, because people who really, well-educated people who know about the Hermetic tradition and the actual Hermetic tradition and its origins and all, the way the authors presented this book, they presented it with a glamour. They wrote it as if they were revealing hidden secrets of ancient Egyptian and Greco-Egyptian philosophy that were not hardly known at all, and it was only known to certain initiates, and they cast a veil of glamour over this book, which at the time they wrote it was certainly a good idea and was accepted. But now the discerning, well-informed student is going to look at this, especially the introduction, and they're going to say, "Oh boy, I'm really being flim-flammed here." And so one of the things that we want to do tonight in our discussion of the Kybalion is to somehow apologize for this, and then make sure you understand how really, really valuable this little book is. So for those of you who look skeptically at it, I hope after our discussion tonight you will not look so skeptically at it, and I hope you will realize how really important it is. Now, what the Kybalion does is it takes the basic fundamental principles and the great secret of Hermetic philosophy, which is that man is a microcosm, a miniature, the individual human being, especially according to Hermes, if he knows it, if he realizes it, the individual human being is a miniature of the universe. As above, so below. The human imagination can therefore influence the greater universe, and that you are, in essence, if you realize it, you are the center of the universe. And this is a concept that derives not so much in ancient Egypt, although there is ancient Egyptian input, both in Hermetic philosophy and in the Kybalion, but this particular philosophy came around, or began around 500 BC in ancient Greece, and probably, as anthropologists are aware, it probably was originally inspired by a Scythian shaman who came down from the Altai Mountains up where Mongolia is, and introduced the Greeks to maybe he had some dried mushrooms in his knapsack or something or other. But anyway, around about 500 BC, the Greeks suddenly, with Pythagoras and Empedocles, Heraclitus, Parmenides especially, and then a little later Plato, they realized that man was directly connected with the divine, and they became fascinated with the idea that our perception of the universe was intensely individual, and consciousness became a very, very important thing. Now, this guy by the name of James, who came up with a thing later, a book called The Bicameral Mind, and he thought this was some sudden human mutation that occurred. No, I don't think it was. It was probably, let's say, inspired by this shaman that came down from Central Asia and got these Greek philosophers who were, they wanted to philosophize, and boy, when they got their eyes open and they looked at this, they said, wow, only the individual human being perceives the universe. And we get logic from this, and this was the start of philosophy. This was the start of the great Hermetic secret, the idea that the Kybalion explains as the whole universe is mental. And the Kybalion states that the universe is mental, and that actually the universe our whole universe is the mind of God. And because we see the universe from our mind, and we're linked to the divine, therefore we are a miniature of God's mind, and we're looking at the universe from our center of the universe. And anywhere we are, that's the center of the universe. Now, Along with this, of course, you got the idea that the universe is boundless, and so it has no center except where you are. You're the center, because there is no center otherwise. Now, I know this is kind of hard to grasp, but the Kybalion does, and they use a little different method in the Kybalion to get this secret across. And their method is to say that the all, capital ALL, is small ALL, the all, that's your all, is in the all, capital ALL, and the capital ALL is also in the small ALL. The all is in the all, and the all is in the all, and everything is mental. And so therefore, whatever you want to change, whatever you want to accomplish, just essentially use a mental process of transmutation to do it. This really is Hermetic philosophy. So what the Kybalion does is it takes this Hermetic philosophy and it modernizes it. It brings it up to the beginning of modern science. It calls upon the philosophy of Herbert Spencer and what is called New Thought, a philosophy developed first developed by a fellow by the name of Quimby. The idea that goes along with the modern discoveries of electricity and electromagnetism, magnetism, and the first beginnings of radiation, and all of these things that we were beginning to discover in the second half of the 19th century, and that Herbert Spencer was beginning to philosophize about. It takes the original Hermetic principles, and it applies these new discoveries too. Now, this actually predates Einstein. So the Kybalion's philosophy predates Einstein, and yet it leapfrogs right over Einstein, and it perfectly matches up with the latest theories of quantum physics. M theory. You can go through the Kybalion and you can find M theory very well represented. Now, our guest tonight, as I said, will be Paul Clark, and he should be calling in pretty shortly. And then we're going to discuss how this book came about and what the philosophy behind it, and we're going to be able to kind of analyze it. Meanwhile, while we're waiting for Paul, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good. Yeah, let me introduce Paul, Dr. Paul Clark, who is the steward of the Fraternity of Hidden Light, and that's of course a group that derives from Paul Case's teachings. And Paul, I believe you got a doctorate studying this philosophy upon which the Kybalion is based. And so, why don't you, I was going to go down and outline the principles, mentalism and principle of correspondence, the principle of vibration, the principle of polarity, the principles of rhythm, and the principle of cause and effect, and the principle of gender. And so I'll turn it over to you and tell us about how the Kybalion came about and what's behind it.
Well, the Kybalion was a kind of fortuitous nexus of three metaphysical, occult, philosophical minds around the first part of the 20th century. There's been a lot of controversy about who wrote the Kybalion, who were the three initiates, because as you mentioned earlier, William Walter Atkinson used pseudonyms in his various books. He wrote a book called The Secret of Mental Magic under his own name, and that kind of established him. And then he had an in-house publishing company called the Yoga Publication Society, which gave them a ready avenue to publish works on the various mystical sciences. So when he wrote books on Rosicrucianism, like the Secret Mysteries of the Rosicrucians, he would write under the pseudonym Magnus Incognito, which means secret master. And when he wrote on yoga, he would use his teacher's name, Yoga Ramacharaka. But for this one book, he moved from being a singular pseudonym, a singular pen name, to the name The Three Initiates. And the reason being was that there were actually two other associates that were involved with him in the production of this very unique text as an introduction to Hermetic philosophy. And as I said, there's been a lot of controversy about who were the other two initiates. And I've had people actually say, well, he wrote it by himself and just used that pseudonym. That would be very highly unlikely, because he always used singular pseudonyms when he was writing by himself. And in this case, he used the multiple pseudonym of three initiates. When I was very, very young, 12, 13, 14, I came in contact with the teachings of Paul Foster Case and the organization that he founded, Builders of the Adytum, which still exists. And I was told, as I grew up in that organization, by Paul Foster Case's widow and his successor, Ann Davies. Paul Foster Case's widow was named Harriet Case. And I got to meet and know them very well. And I spent several weekends at Harriet's house when I would be visiting the West Coast. And I asked her, I said, who were the three initiates? She said, well, of course, that Paul was one of the three initiates. So that names two initiates right off the bat. We have William Atkinson and Paul Foster Case. And the third one was the one that was always hard to place. I said, well, who was the third initiate? Now, Harriet said it was Michael Whitty. Anne confirmed it. It was Michael Whitty. Michael Whitty was Paul Case's mentor in the Alpha and Omega on a branch of the Golden Dawn some years before. And I know that some people are going to object and say, well, Michael Whitty didn't meet Paul Case until after the Kybalion was published. But that's not actually what the records show. Paul met Bill Atkinson in 1907. And as I said, Bill Atkinson was already the author of The Secret of Mental Science, or Mental Magic, In 1908, the copyright for the Kybalion was established. Now, in 1909, Paul Case records meeting a Dr. Flood in Chicago. Now, it puts these three people all in Chicago. And Dr. Flood mentions that he represented one of Paul's mutual teachers. Maybe it was Bill Atkinson, because Bill was quite senior to Paul. 1912, we see the publication of the Kybalion. That's when it really took off. In 1916, Paul Case wrote an article on the tarot attributions in the occult magazine, The Word. And because of that, because he was publishing what was then assumed to be secret teachings, he was approached by Michael Whitty, who later became, as I mentioned, his mentor, and invited to join the Alpha and Omega. The point is that that's when he was approached by Michael Whitty. That's not necessarily when he met Michael Whitty. So we have two candidates for that third initiate. We have this Dr. Flood or Michael Whitty. Now, as I mentioned previously, Harriet Case and Ann Davies both said that it was Michael Whitty who was the third initiate. I find it interesting that now I've read in a recent book that there's a move by the Chicago-based still Yoga Publication Society to recopyright or reissue this book, The Kybalion, under the sole authorship of William Atkinson. And I remember that they tried to do this about 30 years ago, and the then head of BOTA, Ann Davies, and her successor, Jacob Foose, protested to the Chicago-based Yoga Publication Society, and they backed off of that. Now, this would indicate to me that it's confirmation that Paul Case was one of the authors and was one of the three initiates.
Yeah, well, I had suggested to you yesterday that you are probably the best qualified to publish an annotated, reintroduced annotated version of the original Kybalion. And this, I think we very much need this. I haven't read Doreen Virtue's new version of the Kybalion. I know Doreen Virtue, and I like her. I haven't read that book yet. She probably did a good job, but that's a version of it. I think that'd be really, really good if we had an updated, annotated, footnoted, where the sources come from, and so we can rehabilitate this. One of my problems, as I said in the introduction tonight, was that the glamour, all the glamour that they put in that introduction, we can forgive them for that. But new people the kind of people, the well-educated college-level people coming in and reading that glamorous introduction are going to say, "Oh, come on, this is BS," and that we need to somehow overcome that, because the book is so valuable. It's so valuable, and it really does. I mean, and and I know that the book really does. It takes Hermetic philosophy and brings it up to date. It brings it right up to where we are right now in quantum physics.
Well, it's certainly a lot easier to read than the Corpus Hermeticum, isn't it?
Well, it is, except that the cover. Well, that particular the new translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, the Way of Hermes. That's beautiful. I want to really recommend that. You got it. You probably have it sitting right there. I can't remember all those authors. There's about 4 authors of this new translation of they're called the Way of Hermes. But that's a lot easier reading than the old one, than the old translations. But the Kybalion, no, the Kybalion really is Hermetic. I know that there's a lot of New Thought. Walter Atkinson was a New Thought scholar too, and so was, and you say Whitty was too. Whitty was into New Thought.
Yeah, he wrote the first primer of New Thought, which is still considered by many to be one of the best introductory texts into the subject of New Thought and Theosophy.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite New Thoughters is Frank Channing Haddock, who he came kind of late on the scene, but his Power of Will is one of my favorite self-help type books. So much New Thought, the New Thought movement spawned Napoleon Hill and oh gosh, Emmett Fox and think we can think of any number. We mentioned Earl Nightingale, and this is New Thought's very positive, and that's an aspect of. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you even consider the recent phenomena of The Secret by Esther Hicks, and that movie. Here is a direct descendant, basically, of the Hermetic teachings. Ernest Holmes, one of the founders of the modern New Thought movement, enunciates in his textbook a principle which says, "As above, so below. As within, so without." And that's a direct descendant of the first line of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, which is pure Hermeticism.
For sure. And this Secret now I'm looking at this little book, The Secret it's by Rhonda Byrne and a whole bunch of people. And this is all New Thought, and this was on the bestseller list for quite a while. It's simplistic, and one of the things, of course, that the simplistic promoters of this don't tell you is that New Thought, at least the way I gather it from Haddock, from my reading of Haddock, it requires discipline. It requires you can't just think it, use the law of attraction, and if you want it, you're going to get it. There's more to it than that, and yet, would you kind of give us an idea of some of the deeper aspects of New Thought?
Well, first off, when we look at New Thought, the primary principle that differentiates it from several other religious approaches is that it believes in the creative power of consciousness, that consciousness creates. Now, what's left out many times is the fact that consciousness creates through images, symbols, and pictures when they're emotionally charged. We sometimes that gets left in the background because a lot of people think there's something wrong with the desire. There's something wrong with passion, but that's a critical ingredient on making your consciousness a creative matrix for your manifestation. And that's the basis of New Thought, that you need to energize your desires, picture them, use symbols, and then your deep consciousness will proceed to link you up with the materials, the people, the resources, and the opportunity to fulfill your dreams. I was listening to a fellow was one of the DJs on one of the local talk radio stations. He was humiliating the secret. He says, I don't believe that you can just think your way to success. Well, I would challenge him to anybody who has not thought their way to success that is a success now. You have to be open to those opportunities.
Right.
There's not a building in the world that wasn't first a mental concept, a picture, an idea in the mind of an architect. It's just the way the universe works. It doesn't work. It works. The creative process always proceeds from within to the without. And we find this in Hermeticism. This is
absolutely
where this comes from. The universe is
right.
Yeah, the universe is consciousness. You made a couple comments about the glamour that they used in the Kybalion and how that sometimes puts modern scholars off. We have to realize that these guys that were writing it were used to using mythology, in which mythology symbols create the symbols they're using tell a story about the interaction of consciousness. If you would just take that introduction where it says that Hermes Trismegistus was this ancient Egyptian sage who was contemporary with Abraham, and transfer that into saying the Hermetic teaching, the Hermetic current of initiation and philosophy was contemporary with the ancient wisdom of Israel, the Kabbalah, and realize that those contemporaries were not necessarily people, but were currents of thought, and change Hermes Trismegistus to the word Alexandria, we find that everything they said is basically true. Everybody came from all around the world. I mean, that's been documented time and again to study in Alexandria the same teaching that we're talking about tonight that's presented in a very easily understood way in the Kybalion.
Yeah. Yep. And was it I did this, one of my fictional things where Theon is introducing to the students when they arrive in the library in Alexandria, and he says, "These are the three most important people in the world," and nobody can figure it out. And he says, "Well, first there was Pythagoras. He taught us how to think. Then there was Plato. He taught us what to think. And then there was Alexander. He taught us to think in Greek." Yeah, so the University Library at Alexandria, that's the start. That's where all this got put together, and I personally think that had a lot of influence on Jesus too. And there is Hermetic. You would point out the positive aspect of new thought. That there's an aspect of that in Hermetic philosophy too, because Hermetic philosophy, you could say that Gnosticism is behind it, but it is a positive. Hermetic philosophy is a positive form of Gnosticism. It has a strong infusion of Neoplatonism in it, and so consequently, it's positive. It's more upbeat than Gnosticism, and
Poke, they found in we have to remember that most of our ideas about Gnosticism is through the enemies of Gnosticism. We only get their thoughts by their critics that were trying to argue against them. But you mentioned the Way of Hermes. There's an introductory essay by Dr. Giles Gispel. He's a professor at Harvard, and he mentioned something that I didn't know, that in some of the scrolls that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are writings of Hermes. They'll show, which, we see that these Gnostic currents are starting to come forward, and they were sourced in the Great Library, as you mentioned, and Great School of Alexandria.
Well, that of course, that Hermes, during the early Italian Renaissance period, the Catholic Church was enamored. Catholic intellectuals, they were enamored of Hermes because they thought he was contemporary with Moses, or even perhaps before Moses, and they saw so much of what Jesus' teachings that were in the Hermetic treatises, and there is a relationship, as you know, and they were almost to the point of canonizing him. They had statues of Hermes Trismegistus with that big hat in the churches, at least in the, out in the gardens around the churches and all that, and they were giving imprimaturs on Hermetic books and whatever, and then some philologist, about 1610, some philologist figured out that the Hermetic treatises that they had were post-Christian. They were about 200 A.D. by content analysis. And at that point,
yes,
at that point, they had to dethrone, to decanonize, and you couldn't get an imprimatur in a Hermetic book after that, because they had to realize that he was post-Christian, not pre-Christian. But now, according to the foreword in that Way of Hermes book that I mentioned, actually they're saying now that was just the version, that was just the particular version of Hermes that Ficino had translated, but that actually Hermes was pre-Christian. The Hermetic treatises were pre-Christian.
And Dr. Gitzfeld mentions that.
Yeah, but to get back to the Kybalion, though, the Kybalion, as I say, when you look at what they do with the idea in the Kybalion that the universe is mental. The universe is the mind of God, and we are in the mind of God, and we are a replica of the mind of God. This is straight Hermetic philosophy, and then the principles that they extrapolate, that they get from New Thought, under the influence of science and Spencer. I might mention that Spencer is the great forgotten philosopher. Nobody talks about Spencer anymore, and Bertrand Russell wrote this great big huge book on Western philosophy. It's about 1,200 pages long. He never mentions Spencer once, and he never even doesn't even have Spencer in the index. You can't find Spencer anywhere. They hated him. The new philosophers hated Spencer, and they hated him essentially because he was libertarian, and he believed in the survival of the fittest, and he was an anti-socialist, and so he's been written out. But Spencer, aside from that, whether you like that or whether you don't, Spencer had a lot of influence, I think, on the Kybalion. At least I think so. And I think he had influence on New Thought. But I don't know. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree. It's a perfect example of the censorship of the orthodoxy. They if it doesn't fit in with their agenda, they can almost rewrite history by, as you just suggested, writing this major textbook on philosophy and eliminating one of the main sources of philosophy.
Spencer was considered the greatest living philosopher while he was alive. He was considered the greatest living English philosopher, and the only mistake that he really made was he followed Lamarck and his evolutionary ideas. He followed Lamarck, and Lamarck was wrong. You can't breed tailless mice by chopping off the tails of mama and papa mice. You just can't do it. But other than that, that was Spencer's error, and that kind of skewed some of his evolutionary ideas a little bit. But that's no reason to write the man out completely. And he was very, very influential, and also in the Kybalion, if you recall, in here they actually say that I think it was which one of the authors that said this was that Spencer, they thought, was the reincarnation of Heraclitus, and Heraclitus, of course, is one of the Greek philosophers that was behind the Hermetic tradition. Heraclitus believed that everything was in flux. Everything in the universe was in a state of change. And of course, that certainly goes along with it. Yeah. Now, on the principles of vibration, let's talk a little bit, and this gives me a chance to mention your latest literary effort, Yeah, the Dark Brotherhood. Oh boy, yeah. Now let me see. Paul, with his co-author C.L. Forbes, and that's not Charles London Forbes. No, that's C.L. Forbes.
Actually,
Paul,
I asked my co-author if we could use her name, and she said absolutely. So you can.
Oh, she did. Okay. So now what are we going to call C.L. Forbes?
Cindy.
I'll have a call her Cindy Forbes. Now Cindy, but let's also state this, that both Paul and Cindy, both what we would call in the Hermetic tradition, what we would call adepts. And Cindy, I don't know whether you want to mention her particular fraternal affiliation or not. You're of course you're the steward of the Fraternity of Hidden Light. Cindy is also rather high-ranking in another very prominent esoteric fraternity. Now, the Dark Brotherhood is a thriller. It's kind of like somewhere between the Da Vinci Code and Doctor Strange. I mean, this is really. By the way, I'm almost through it. I'm almost to the climax here, and I think it is just absolutely terrific. It's a page turner. You can't put it down. But the reason why I want to mention it in the course of this discussion is that one of the principles of one of the operative principles of the Kybalion is vibration, and vibration is one of the major aspects of string theory, M theory.
That's correct.
And yeah, and you've got in this Dark Brotherhood, we got it. We got this CIA agent, lady CIA agent, who apparently got assigned to this job before she got a chance to get cross-trained by psyops at Fort Bragg. So she didn't know how to stare at goats, and she didn't know how to stare at anything. So the two adepti have to get her on the job training. And in the course of doing that, you've managed to get a lot of good occult instruction across without really boring us. Story moves right along. But obviously, we got to train this gal so she can do her job. So this is a good way to do it. But your explanation of M theory in here, I thought was just really, really, really good. And talk about the vibration of the strings in M theory, and this goes right along with what we're talking about in the Kybalion. In fact, I think, personally, I don't know whether you agree with me on this, Paul, but I think what the Kybalion does is it leapfrogs right over Einstein, because relativity didn't get accepted until the 1920s. It leapfrogs right over Einstein and lands in M theory, string theory, holographic universe. It lands right in there, and it's perfectly happy right in that area. Would you?
I was amazed when one of the textbooks that we had when I was in graduate school was Michael Talbot's The Holographic Universe, and I started reading The Holographic Universe and several other books, and I said, "My gosh, this is a modern physicist, and he's echoing the Hermetic principles that are given in the Kybalion." And I found this confirmed time and time again that modern physics right now is looking certain representatives, very respected representatives are looking and describing the universe as being a great mind, that it's made up of consciousness. Of course, principle of mentalism in the Kybalion says that. And everything in the string theory says that it's made up of all these vibrating strings, and the only thing that differentiates one manifestation from another is the rate of vibration.
Right.
And that's also in the Kybalion. It just is amazing how modern physics is now confirming Hermetic doctrine that goes back thousands of years.
Right. And also the principle of duality. Everything in the universe, in another sense, is a binary.
That's right.
Everything is, and so that gives us the positive and the negative. That even gives us the gender principle. That gives us the polarity principle. And it gives us this idea that the universe is essentially information.
And if you find yourself in a manifestation, you're experiencing some kind of circumstances, you can the Kybalion Hermetic philosophy says that through your mind, which is your instrument to operate directly on consciousness in the matrix of manifestation, you can polarize to the other end of the pole and change the circumstances. Now, is it going to change magically morph something out there? No, that's not what they're talking about. It changes the matrix of manifestation, and the matrix then will later, as it manifest a new set of circumstances, something that's more in line with your goals and your desires. It's the paradigm shift, the paradigm shift that's important.
And it's also like we know and we teach that what you visualize, you visualize it, it becomes a preform, and it will manifest itself. And the more emotional loading you put on it, and the more strength the more realistically you visualize it, the stronger and the sooner it will occur. And I thought Alain Duquette he took Plato's idea of the chair and used a Kabbalistic example, in the Chicken Kybalion. He says way up there in Atziluth, God thinks rest. And then in Bria, these two guys in Bria, they say, I think God wants a chair. And then down in Zira, the engineers get on the drawing board and they start designing chairs. And then down in the Shia, we got the showroom, and you can go in and buy the chairs.
A particular type of chair. Every step on that manifestation was a exercise in restriction and limitation, which most people say that's bad. Well, you would never have anything if you didn't have limit, because every time you move one step closer to manifestation, you've eliminated other options. So it's not bad. It's the way consciousness works.
And also, too, that the whole universe, everything changes. Everything continually changes, and that's another thing that Kybalion points out. Everything's in a state of flux. Going back to Heraclitus, everything's in a state of flux, and everything changes, and so therefore, the visualization of a thing is actually almost more alive than the final static result. Because the visualization is in the process, it's vibrating faster really than the final result, and so you thoughts in this sense, you could say thoughts are almost more powerful than their own physical manifestation.
Well, I know that in the Kybalion it mentions that at spirit everything is vibrating so fast it appears to be at rest, just like a fan. It's swirling so fast the blades appear to disappear. And you come down to the other end of the spectrum, manifestation, things are vibrating so slow they appear to be at rest. But
let me ask you.
Any good physicist will tell you they're all vibrating.
Let me ask you this, though. One thing about the Kybalion, that it does mention the different spiritual planes in here, and I would think, just right offhand, I would think that that's an influence of theosophy. And maybe it is, but then it also could be coming from Vedanta. And I understand that Vivekananda was considered a new thought philosopher.
Well, he certainly came here about the same time that Theosophy was kicking into full gear with Blavatsky's society, and New Thought was already here, and there seems to, I think they probably influenced each other to a large extent, because it's a natural thing for a true teacher like Vivekananda to look at something and see a kindred soul, a kindred philosophy. The movement is to move towards agreement. I've seen it time and time again, and you have too, where people like to condemn anybody else as a competitor. And it's not really, we're not competitors, we're partners. We see things and we emphasize certain aspects, but we're really, just like in Alexandria, we're bringing gold from one country, frankincense from another country, and when we get there, we can share these insights and these imports, if you will. I'm using that as a figurative speech.
It's always nice. It's always nice to give the other guy credit, though. Use his ideas, but give him credit, and which often we do. I think that's one of the things, as I say, with the Kybalion. It's such a wonderful little book, and it has so much wonderfully valuable material, which is genuinely hermetic, that I think it needs a sort of a scholarly kind of a setting, It needs to be set in a scholarly frame, yeah. And once
I would agree with you.
Yeah. Once it is, that will solve the problem of the cynics looking at it and saying, But on the theosophy thing, let's consider this. That probably, I would think that the earliest divisions of the soul, the earliest divisions of the human soul, the earliest intimations of the etheric, the astral, the mental, and the spiritual come from ancient Egypt.
Absolutely.
And really ancient Egypt. I mean, pyramid texts way back.
Exactly.
And so that part of it is also could definitely be said to be hermetic, filtered through from ancient Egypt. And that validates some of the statements that are made in there. No, I think, as I said, I think this little book is one of the things that every student of the Western tradition should certainly have in his library and her library, and read it and savor it and study it and internalize it. Yeah.
You mentioned, you were kind enough to mention the Dark Brotherhood and the discussion there about the M theory. And I do know that Cindy was primarily responsible for the discussion. And she was in conference with some physicists, a doctor of physics at USC, talking about and trying to get the physics right, because she had read the Kybalion, and she knew that this Hermetic philosophy had some correspondences, and so she wanted to make sure it was right and wrote it in there into the novel, because this was a way that we had of not only telling a good yarn, which is a lot of fun to begin with, and I hope is enjoyable to the reader, but it's a way of getting across some very advanced philosophical concepts. And I applaud her, because she did that so much better than I could have done that.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I congratulate her on that. I think she did a beautiful job. That's one of the clearest quick explanations of M theory. And I read Mishu Kaku didn't do any better than that. I thought that is real short and doesn't interrupt the flow of the story at all. And the device of training this on-the-job training for this female agent, bringing her up to speed on what, I imagine if let's put the whole context in reality. If they wanted to have an agent to accompany these guys on this expedition to recover the blasting rod and the ancient grimoire and seal the gate of chaos and all that, Langley would have sent the agent to Fort Bragg and put him through about 3 months of psyops. And then she would have. But what you did was you gave her on the job training. That fitted right into the story, and so it didn't interrupt the story at all. Sometimes when people take fictional books and try to make them teaching vehicles, it doesn't work, because it's obviously, okay, here comes the lesson, But the way you guys did it, it doesn't interrupt the story at all. It makes it better. And so that was a very, 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 very well thought out, very clever device, and I really appreciated it. Now, on the back to the Kybalion, so we can summarize by saying that this little book was written by William Walter Atkinson and Paul Case. And what's Whitty's first name again?
Michael, possibly Michael Whitty, probably Michael Whitty, according to
yeah. And so they were the authors, and we can say that they definitely did base it on the major Hermetic premises, and then they used their knowledge of new thought, and of course Herbert Spencer's input into that, and they tied the whole process together. And perhaps there's a little influence of Theosophy, or certainly a little influence of Vedanta, but that also relates to the ancient Egyptian divisions of the soul. And so, essentially, what they're saying in the introduction, as glamorous as it may seem, it actually, if you dig way down deep, they're really telling the truth. And the only thing I would say is that now there are enough. The Hermetic principles really haven't been lost. They're there, and that Way of Hermes book is certainly, the new one, it certainly makes it a lot easier to get the original. I would recommend for students to take the Way of Hermes, that little book, and take the Kybalion, this little book, and read the two of them. Read the two of them together, and I think they perfectly complement each other.
Can I share an anecdote?
Yeah. And so, you're working on another, your character that you've created here is sort of the Sherlock Holmes of the occult, and this is Arthur Alexander, and he kind of like Langdon in Brown. Oh, let me say this. This book reads like Dan Brown. It reads like a Dan Brown thriller. It has that pace and that relentless drive, and it's a page turner. You can't put it down. And along with teaching you a lot about practical occultism. Now, what are your plans on the next book?
Well, we've got some nonfictions that I want to make sure that we get into print before we go to the next fiction one. But we're looking at probably sometime next year coming out with the sequel to The Dark Brotherhood, and tentatively we've got several plot lines that we're working on. But I think the one that we may be coming out with it's going to be called Blood of the Alchemist. And I won't reveal too much about that one now, except, as they say, the secret's in the blood.
Yeah, the secret's in the blood. And you remember in Beyond Lemuria, that was a pretty dark secret.
That's right.
And so I don't want to give away what you're working on, but that aspect is very. So there's a lot to that, and on the good side and on the very, very evil side.
But it does give another whole new meaning to the phrase "saved by the blood," doesn't it?
Well, yes, it does, and it also too. Remember what Max said. They've been stealing children, taking them on their side of the vortex for the last 1,000 years, and this baby blood. To which Colonel Rich said, the fountain of youth.
That's true.
To which Max said, some of us have children, Colonel. That's not funny.
That's right. But I say one more, and we got time to say one more short story about the Kybalion.
Very short, because we're running real close.
I gave this as a birthday present, the Kybalion, to a New Thought minister, very well known, had been in the business for well over 15 years. And he said to me after he'd read it, he said, Paul, I always had the keys to the secrets of consciousness, but you just gave me the set of locks.
Oh boy, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, okay, well next week we're going the seventh ray. We'll probably, if it's not back from the printers, it will be very shortly. Next week we'll be discussing the contents of the new seventh ray. And Paul, thanks so much for coming on board and giving us your very special insights on this very important book. And good luck and tell Cindy I think that this book is just this Dark Brother is really a rip snorter. Okay, we'll see you later.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. And the rest of you, good magic.